American narrative to ourselves. American exceptionalism, the shining city on the hill. Here on this soil where the arc of history is meant to bend towards justice, offering ever more access to liberty, equality, justice. A sentiment captured by then Senator Barack Obama back in 2008 following his defeat in the New Hampshire primary.
Yes, we can. It was the call of workers who organized, women who reached for the ballot, a president who chose the moon as our new frontier, and a king who took us to the mountaintop and pointed the way to the promised land. Yes, we can to justice and equality.
It's still one of the most enduring campaign speeches in U.S. history, one that helped transform a primary defeat into ultimately a historic general election win. But is the arc of American history always bending towards justice? Joined now by Leonard Kelly, professor of history at North Carolina State University. She's the author of Right to Ride, Streetcar Boycotts and African American Citizenship. Thanks for joining us, Professor Kelly.
Hi, Melissa. Great to be here.
All right, I want to go to a period of history where you have made important scholarly contributions, that period that I, growing up in the South, learned as redemption. Can you tell us a little bit about sort of what happens with African Americans' sort of newish constitutional rights right at that moment?
Well, it's a mixed bag and an interesting one. I was reading a book last night, and it was talking about the South as a particular challenge to the African American experience and one that changes the American experience. But we have to remember that that redemption period was mirrored by an earlier period in the North with gradual emancipation, a much smaller scale freedom moment. But that freedom moment was met with segregation. And so when it happened again in the American South after the general emancipation and the Civil War, you have this moment of Reconstruction, you have this moment of reimagining what citizenship could be, but again, you have this moment of implementing segregation as federal troops move out, as southern states are emboldened to make their own laws. I thought an interesting mirror to this moment, right? In the ways in which your rights would be left up to the state in which you live, and you could be facing segregation, eventually disfranchisement, terrible tides of racial violence, lynching. It's the height of lynching in that next decade. And so much of what had been earned and fought for and imagined in that Reconstruction moment, in that first mass freedom moment, was completely obliterated within a 20-year period.
And yet it's also your work that taught me for the first time to even think about what it would have meant to actually be alive as that's happening. I think, sometimes the way we're taught history in school is as though everything is a foregone conclusion, right? So there's slavery, there's Reconstruction, there's Jim Crow, there's Civil Rights Movement, right? In this kind of neat patterns, as though each person living in those moments fully expects that that's what's coming next. Tell us about what people who were living in that freedom moment, who just experienced having the right to vote, to run for office, how are they experiencing the descent of Jim Crow?
They're incredulous, they're confused, they're clear and understanding that they knew the people who were enslaving them and oppressing them on unprecedented scales just a few decades ago hadn't gone away. So they are hurt by the moment. They're struck that the nation has turned its back on their rights. But at the same time, they keep fighting. One of the most interesting things that I found, Plessy versus Ferguson is the case that we're taught that after that case, it's over. And in that march of history that you talk about, that after that case, there were no more rights that would be progressive for them. There was no more progress for decades. But when you read the newspapers, the black newspapers in particular during this time period, they sort of cover it, they sort of talk about it, but they didn't have a sense that it was the end. And the movement that I study happens after Plessy. After Plessy, thousands of African Americans boycott segregated streetcars. And it happens in 25 different southern cities across the landscape where they have streetcar systems. They're the brand new technology of the space. They're used pretty heavily in most places. And they start walking, much like the Montgomery bus boycott movement of the 1950s. In 1905, you can see those same kinds of boycotts happening all across the South. And so, as much as we are told that this was a foregone conclusion, they kept fighting.
What difference did it make to resist, to be fighting? I mean, you're talking about, okay, so post Plessy, there's still enough hope, enough energy, enough experience with freedom that people fight, but whew, I mean, it's a long period from the 1890s until the 1960s, if we want to sort of count 65 around voting rights or 64 around civil rights. I mean, if they just kept losing, why fight?
Well, they didn't just keep losing, right? So they lost pretty badly in the time period that I discussed. It's one of the grand failures of a large-scale movement, and probably why it hadn't been studied very deeply before. But those generations plant seeds in the community, in their children, seeds of resistance, seeds of knowledge about who they are. They also make strategic choices during that time period. They decide to really protect their children as best they can from the insults and degradations of segregation, and begin to build a society in resistance to that white supremacist world. And so they build up schools and businesses and institutions of uplift and phenomenal independent churches. And they use that community to buffer and to raise children in ways that let them feel empowered in spite of that outside world. And so it is from that base that the movement begins to grow, that you begin to have a generation of people who continue that fight. And they continue it right away. The founding of the NAACP, we can see in the 19-teens, begins a lighting of that fire of resistance, legal cases, organizing on the ground, giving birth to some of the most amazing people who become our civil rights icons in the next generation.
Do you think that perhaps if there are these spirals, are we always moving towards justice? Is there reason to hope?
I think there's always reason to hope, while we still have the ability to strategize, to fight, to organize. We have new tools that we did not have in previous fights. I'm still a big fan of the ways in which social media has its own ability to make good information be shared as much as it has the ability to make bad information be shared. We have to remember that those systems of backlash, of response, are always going to happen.